In the quaint village of St. Mary Mead, a grand manor hosts the great culinary clash, where ambition simmers and secrets boil over. When charismatic chef Henri Dubois collapses, poisoned by a smudged bitters bottle, the stage is set for murder. Miss Jane Marple, a sharp-eyed spinster with a knack for unraveling deceit, steps into the chaos. As pride, grudges, and jealousy spice the motives of four suspects, a haughty critic, a betrayed baker, a desperate producer, and a vengeful rival, Miss Marple's keen gaze and quiet knitting uncover a deadly recipe. Who stirred the poison into the bisque? The truth, like a perfect dish, is about to be served. Chapter 1. The stage is set. The late summer sun cast a golden glow over St. Mary Mead, its rays filtering through the elms that lined the village green. The usually tranquil hamlet thrummed with an unfamiliar energy, as if the very air had been seasoned with anticipation. At the heart of this stir stood the old manor house, its Georgian facade draped in banners proclaiming the great culinary clash, a televised cooking spectacle that had descended upon the village like a traveling circus. The manor's ballroom, once host to sedate dances, had been transformed into a dazzling studio, its chandeliers glinting above sleek stainless steel counters and cameras that prowled like curious beasts. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her rose-patterned armchair by the cottage window, observed the bustle with a mild but discerning eye. Her knitting needles clicked rhythmically, a soft counterpoint to the distant clamor of arriving vans and chattering crew. She had no particular fondness for television. Its garish noise clashed with her preference for quiet reflection, but her nephew Raymond, ever eager to draw her into the modern world, had insisted she attend. "Aunt Jane," he'd said over tea the previous day, his eyes alight with mischief, "a cooking show is just a village drama with better lighting. You'll see something worth noticing, I'm sure." Miss Marple had smiled at his flattery, her lips curling faintly. Raymond, a writer with a knack for exaggeration, knew her weakness for human nature's intricacies. Intrigued despite herself, she agreed to be a guest of honor, her presence lending a touch of local charm to the production. The manor's grounds were a hive of activity as she arrived, her sensible shoes crunching on the gravel drive. Young men in headsets darted about, barking orders, while villagers gawked from behind hastily erected barriers. Miss Marple, in her tweed skirt and a lavender cardigan that had seen better days, drew little attention, which suited her perfectly. She settled into a cushioned seat near the back of the studio, her knitting bag at her side, and surveyed the scene with the calm precision of one accustomed to unraveling life's subtler threads. The contestants, introduced with fanfare by a slick presenter in a sequined blazer, were a study in contrasts. First was Henri Dubois, a wiry Frenchman whose dark eyes flashed with intensity. His chef's whites were pristine, but his movements carried a theatrical flourish, as if he were performing for an unseen audience. He was, Miss Marple learned from the program notes, a celebrated chef from Lyon, renowned for his bold seafood dishes and a temper to match. She noted the way he tossed his head when addressing the crew, a gesture that reminded her of young Freddie Baxter, the village butcher's son, who'd always strutted to mask his nerves. Next came Clara Henshaw, a local woman whose plain cotton dress and tightly pinned bun belied the quiet determination in her eyes. Clara, the notes said, ran a modest bakery in St. Mary Mead, her scones and sponges the stuff of local legend. Yet there was a tension in her posture, a slight clench of her jaw, that suggested depths Miss Marple intended to explore. She recalled Clara's mother, a reserved woman who'd once confided a fear of being overlooked, like mother, like daughter, perhaps. The final contestant, Beatrice Lyle, glided onto the stage with the poise of a prima ballerina. Her sleek blonde hair and tailored scarlet jacket screamed ambition, and her smile, though dazzling, held a sharpness that Miss Marple recognized at once. Beatrice was a rising star in London's culinary scene, her molecular gastronomy a darling of glossy magazines. Yet her eyes, darting briefly to Henri, betrayed a flicker of something. Envy, perhaps? Miss Marple made a mental note, thinking of Mrs. Eldridge from the Village Fete, whose prize-winning roses had concealed a ruthless streak. Presiding over the affair was Sir Reginald Hawthorne, the judge, whose florid face and impeccable suit exuded an air of self-important authority. A food critic of some renown, he sat at a raised table, his pen poised like a scepter. His introductions were laced with condescension, particularly toward Henri, whom he dismissed as overly theatrical. Miss Marple's needles paused briefly. She knew a bully when she saw one, and Sir Reginald's manner recalled the late Colonel Bantry, whose bluster had often masked insecurity. Behind the scenes, Martin Greaves, the producer, flitted like a nervous moth. His wiry frame and disheveled hair suggested a man perpetually on the edge of chaos, yet his eyes gleamed with a calculating intensity. He adjusted lights, whispered to cameramen, and occasionally glanced at the contestants with an expression Miss Marple couldn't quite place. Ambition? Or something darker? She thought of Mr. Hoskins, the village grocer, who'd once orchestrated a minor scandal to boost his shop's trade. Men like Martin, she mused, thrived on the drama they claimed to control. As the competition began, the studio hummed with energy. Henri attacked his ingredients with gusto, his knife flashing as he prepared a bouillabaisse that promised to be a masterpiece. Clara worked methodically, her hands steady as she measured flour for a Victoria sponge, her face a mask of concentration. Beatrice, meanwhile, wielded pipettes and liquid nitrogen, her station a laboratory of culinary wizardry. The audience, a mix of villagers and invited guests, watched raptly, their murmurs rising with each flourish. Miss Marple, her needles clicking softly, observed not the dishes but the people. She noted Henri's quick glance at Beatrice, a mix of rivalry and disdain. Clara's subtle flinch when Sir Reginald passed her station. Martin's hurried exchange with a technician near the contestants' tables. Human nature, she knew, was a recipe far more complex than any bouillabaisse. And in this glittering arena, where egos clashed and cameras magnified every gesture, she sensed that something was simmering, something that might, in time, prove fatal. Chapter 2. A Recipe for Disaster. The Manor House's transformed ballroom, now a gleaming television studio, pulsed with the frenetic energy of the great culinary clash. The air was thick with the mingled scents of saffron, butter, and sizzling garlic, underscored by the faint hum of cameras gliding on their tracks. The audience, a motley blend of saints, Merry Mead villagers, and invited dignitaries, leaned forward in their seats, their eyes darting between the contestants' stations. Miss Jane Marple, tucked unobtrusively in a corner with her knitting, observed the scene with a quiet intensity, her needles clicking like a metronome against the rising din. She had seen many a village drama unfold, and this, she sensed, was no mere culinary spectacle. There was a tension here, sharp as a chef's knife, waiting to cut through the polished veneer. The first round of the competition had reached its crescendo. Henri Dubois, the fiery French chef, dominated his station with the confidence of a conductor leading an orchestra. His bouillabaisse, a fragrant symphony of seafood and herbs, simmered in a copper pot, its steam curling upward like a siren's call. He moved with a practiced grace, his hands deftly slicing fennel and tossing it into the broth, his dark eyes flashing with a mix of pride and defiance. Miss Marple noted the way he occasionally glanced at the judges' table, where Sir Reginald Hawthorne sat, his florid face set in a permanent scowl. Henri's flourish with a ladle, she thought, was not just for the cameras, but a deliberate challenge to the critics' disdain. She recalled young Tommy Pierce, who'd once brandished a cricket bat with similar bravado to impress the village girls. Boldness, she knew, often masked vulnerability. Clara Henshaw, by contrast, worked with a quiet precision that belied her nervous energy. Her station was a model of order, her ingredients arranged in neat rows, flour dusted lightly on the counter, eggs nestled in a porcelain bowl, and a slab of butter softening in the warmth of the studio lights. Her Victoria sponge, a humble but exacting dish, required no theatrics, yet Miss Marple saw the intensity in Clara's eyes as she whisked her batter, her movements betraying a determination that went beyond mere competition. There was something personal here, Miss Marple mused, thinking of Clara's mother, who'd once toiled silently in the shadow of grander figures. Clara's hands, though steady, trembled slightly as she poured the batter into a tin, and Miss Marple wondered what old wounds drove her focus. Beatrice Lyle, the third contestant, was a study in calculated elegance. Her station resembled a laboratory, with vials of liquid nitrogen and precise pipettes lined up like surgical tools. She was crafting a deconstructed lemon tart, a feat of molecular gastronomy that drew murmurs of awe from the audience. Her scarlet jacket was pristine, her blonde hair pulled back in a sleek chignon, and her movements were as choreographed as a ballet. Yet Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the occasional glance Beatrice cast toward Henri, a flicker of something, resentment, perhaps, that belied her cool exterior. Beatrice's smile, flashed for the cameras, was a masterpiece of artifice, and Miss Marple thought of Mrs. Eldridge, whose prize-winning roses at the village fete had hidden a ruthless streak. Ambition, she knew, could be a dangerous ingredient. Sir Reginald Hawthorne, the judge, presided over the chaos with an air of lofty disdain. His tailored suit and monogrammed cufflinks gleamed under the studio lights, but his expression was one of perpetual dissatisfaction. He scribbled notes with a gold fountain pen, his lips pursed as he sampled a preliminary dish from a lesser contestant who'd already been eliminated. "Adequate," he declared, his voice carrying a sting that silenced the room. Miss Marple watched him closely, noting the way. His eyes lingered on Henri, not with admiration but with a cold appraisal. She thought of Colonel Bantry, whose bluster at village meetings had often concealed a need to dominate. Sir Reginald, she suspected, thrived on cutting others down to size. Martin Greaves, the producer, darted through the studio like a nervous insect, his wiry frame barely containing his restless energy. His crumpled shirt and disheveled hair suggested a man stretched thin, yet his eyes gleamed with a peculiar intensity as he directed cameramen and adjusted microphones. He paused briefly near Henri's station, ostensibly to check a lighting rig, but Miss Marple noticed his fingers linger near a small bottle on the counter, a bottle of bitters, an odd choice for a bouillabaisse. Martine's quick glance around, as if ensuring he was unobserved, reminded her of Mr. Hoskins, the village grocer, who'd once slipped an extra coin into his till with similar furtiveness. Men like Martin, she thought, were always cooking up something beyond the script. The presenter, a young man with slicked back hair and a sequined blazer, kept the audience engaged with a stream of commentary, his voice amplified to a grating pitch. And here we are, folks, at the heart of the great culinary clash. Will Henri's bouillabaisse reign supreme, or will Beatrice's avant-garde creation steal the show? Stay tuned. The audience clapped on cue, but Miss Marple's attention remained on the contestants, their interactions a silent drama beneath the presenter's chatter. As the first round drew to a close, the contestants presented their dishes to Sir Reginald. Henri approached first, his bouillabaisse steaming in a rustic tureen. He ladled a portion into a bowl with a flourish, his voice rich with confidence, as he described the dish's Provençal origins. Sir Reginald sniffed the broth, his nose wrinkling as if detecting a fault. "Overly ambitious," he pronounced, his tone dripping with condescension. "The saffron drowns the subtler notes. A pity." Henry's jaw tightened, but he managed a tight smile, his eyes burning with suppressed rage. Miss Marple noted the exchange, thinking of the village blacksmith, who'd once smashed a hammer against his anvil after a similar slight. Pride, she knew, could simmer into something dangerous. Clara's Victoria sponge was next, its golden surface dusted with icing sugar. She presented it with a quiet dignity, her voice soft but clear, as she explained her recipe's simplicity. Sir Reginald cut a slice, his knife slicing through the cake with surgical precision. He chewed slowly, his face impassive, then said, "Competent, but uninspired. A village fete might applaud it, but this is a national stage." Clara's cheeks flushed, but she nodded, her eyes fixed on the floor. Miss Marple saw the hurt in her posture, recalling Clara's mother, who'd borne similar slights with the same quiet endurance. There was a strength there, she thought, but also a shadow of resentment. Beatrice's deconstructed tart was a spectacle, served on a slate plate with swirls of lemon foam and shards of caramelized sugar. The audience gasped as she explained the chemistry behind her creation, her voice smooth and confident. Sir Reginald raised an eyebrow, clearly impressed despite himself, but his critique was measured. "Clever," he said, "but technique alone does not a masterpiece make. Emotion is lacking." Beatrice's smile didn't waver, but Miss Marple caught the brief tightening of her lips, a sign of frustration. She thought of Mrs. Eldridge again, whose composure had cracked only when her roses lost to a rival's. Ambition, Miss Marple reflected, could curdle into something bitter. The second round began with a fresh challenge, a signature dish to showcase each contestant's unique style. Henri, undeterred by Sir Reginald's critique, threw himself into a new creation, a seafood bisque laced with exotic spices. He moved with renewed vigor, his voice ringing out as he narrated his process for the cameras. "This," he declared, tossing a pinch of saffron into the pot, "is the soul of the sea." The audience clapped, caught up in his passion, but Miss Marple's eyes were drawn to a small bottle of bitters on his station, the same one Martin had lingered near. She made a mental note, her needles pausing briefly as she considered its significance. Clara, meanwhile, opted for a savory dish, a herb-crusted lamb pie that promised rustic comfort. Her hands moved with the same methodical care, but Miss Marple noticed a faint tremor as she rolled out the pastry. Was it nerves or something deeper? She thought of Clara's mother again, whose quiet demeanor had hidden a fierce protectiveness. Clara, she suspected, carried a similar burden, one that might explain her intensity. Beatrice's second dish was another feat of innovation, a smoked salmon sphere that burst with flavor when pierced. Her station was a whirlwind of activity, her pipettes and sous vide machine drawing curious glances from the crew. Yet Miss Marple saw her glance at Henri's station, her eyes narrowing as he bantered with the presenter. There was history there, she thought, a rivalry that went beyond this competition. She recalled a village seamstress who'd sabotaged a rival's dress out of envy. Beatrice's poise, she suspected, masked a similar edge. The studio's energy shifted abruptly, like a gust of wind before a storm. Henri, mid-sentence as he described his bisque to the presenter, faltered. His hand flew to his chest, his face contorting in pain. "Mon Dieu," he gasped, his voice a hoarse whisper. The copper pot clattered to the counter, its contents spilling in a crimson tide. He staggered, clutching the edge of his station, then collapsed, his body crumpling to the floor. The audience gasped, the cameras swiveled, and the presenter froze, his script forgotten. Martin Greaves shouted for the crew to cut the feed, but the cameras kept rolling, capturing every moment of the chaos. Miss Marple's needles stilled, her eyes darting across the room. Clara stood frozen, her rolling pin suspended mid-air, her face pale as the flour on her hands. Beatrice's hands paused over her salmon sphere, her expression unreadable, but her eyes fixed on Henri's crumpled form. Sir Reginald rose from his seat, his face a mask of shock, though Miss Marple noted his hands were steady as he adjusted his cufflinks. Martin was a blur of motion, barking orders to the crew, but his earlier intensity seemed to have shifted to something else. Panic or calculation? The audience erupted in murmurs, some standing to gawk, others clutching their neighbors in dismay. Paramedics rushed in, their footsteps echoing in the suddenly silent studio. They knelt beside Henri, checking his pulse, their faces grim. A doctor, summoned from the village, shook his head after a brief examination. "He's gone," he said quietly, and the words hung in the air like a death knell. The cameras, still rolling, caught the moment, and Miss Marple knew this tragedy would be broadcast far beyond Saint. Mary Mead. She thought of a village tragedy years ago, when a farmer's sudden death had revealed secrets long buried. Death, she knew, was rarely an accident in such charged settings. Inspector Craddock, a sturdy man with a no-nonsense air, arrived swiftly, his constables cordoning off the studio. The audience was ushered out, their whispers of poison and murder trailing behind them. Miss Marple remained, her status as a guest of honor granting her a quiet authority. Craddock, who'd crossed paths with her before, gave her a respectful nod. "Miss Marple," he said, "I suppose you've already seen something we haven't." She smiled faintly, her eyes still scanning the room. "Only what's there to see, Inspector," she replied, but her mind was already at work, sifting through the ingredients of this disaster. Henri's station was a tableau of chaos, the spilled bisque, the scattered fennel, and that bottle of bitters, its cap slightly askew. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on it, her thoughts racing. She saw Clara's trembling hands, Beatrice's fleeting glance, Sir Reginald's steady composure, and Martin's nervous energy. Each, she knew, had a reason to wish Henri ill: pride, resentment, ambition, or desperation. She thought of her village, where a poisoned jar of jam at a fete had unraveled a web of jealousy. Here, in this glittering studio, the stakes were higher, but the human heart was the same. As the constables began their work, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her needles clicking softly. The stage was set, the players revealed, and now, she thought, the real drama would begin. Someone had added a fatal ingredient to Henri's recipe, and she intended to find out who. Chapter 3. The Shadow of Suspicion. The manor house, so recently a stage for culinary spectacle, now lay under a pall of unease. The glittering studio, its cameras stilled and its lights dimmed, resembled a theater after the final curtain, save for the grim presence of Inspector Craddock and his constables. The air, once fragrant with saffron and butter, now carried the sterile tang of antiseptic as forensic officers moved methodically, dusting surfaces and bagging items from Henri Dubois's station. Outside, the villagers of St. Mary Mead lingered beyond the cordons, their whispers weaving a tapestry of speculation that drifted through the manor's open windows. Miss Jane Marple, seated in a high-backed chair near the studio's edge, her knitting bag at her feet, observed the scene with her usual quiet acuity. Her needles moved steadily, but her eyes missed nothing: the flicker of a constable's glance, the tense posture of a suspect, the subtle shift in the room's atmosphere. Inspector Craddock, his face set in a determined frown, had taken charge with the efficiency of a man accustomed to order. He was not, Miss Marple thought, without imagination, but his methodical nature sometimes blinded him to the nuances of human behavior. She had worked with him before, in cases where her village wisdom had illuminated what his procedures overlooked, and he had come to value her presence, however reluctantly. "Miss Marple," he said, approaching her with a notebook in hand, "I trust you'll keep your eyes open. As always, this is a nasty business." She inclined her head, her expression mild. "I shall do my best, Inspector," she replied, but her mind was already sifting through the morning's events, separating the flour of fact from the chaff of distraction. The preliminary report from the police surgeon, delivered in hushed tones to Craddock, confirmed what the whispers had suggested. Henri Dubois's death was no accident. Traces of a poison, likely aconite, had been found in his system, though the exact method of delivery was still under investigation. The bitters bottle on his station, its cap askew and its contents partially used, was the prime suspect, now sealed in an evidence bag and sent for analysis. Craddock had ordered the studio locked down, the contestants and key figures confined to the manor's drawing room for questioning. Miss Marple, granted leave to remain as a consulting observer due to her reputation and Raymond's influence with the production team, followed quietly, her frail figure drawing little notice amid the chaos. The drawing room, with its velvet drapes and mahogany furniture, was a stark contrast to the sterile studio. A fire crackled in the grate, casting shadows that danced across the faces of the four suspects: Sir Reginald Hawthorne, Clara Henshaw, Martin Greaves, and Beatrice Lyle. Each sat apart, their postures revealing as much as their words would soon conceal. Miss Marple settled into a corner armchair. Her knitting resumed, its rhythmic click a soft counterpoint to the room's tension. She thought of the village hall during a particularly contentious parish meeting, where every glance and gesture had betrayed secrets. Here, in this grander setting, the stakes were higher, but the human heart, she knew, was no different. Craddock began with Sir Reginald, who rose from his seat with the air of a man accustomed to command. His florid cheeks were flushed, but his voice was steady as he recounted his morning. "I was at the judging table the entire time," he declared, adjusting his cufflinks with a deliberate flourish. "My role is to taste and critique, not to meddle with the contestants' stations. I had no reason to approach Dubois' area, nor did I." His eyes met Craddock's with a hint of defiance, as if daring contradiction. Miss Marple noted the way his fingers lingered on the monogrammed cufflinks, a gesture that reminded her of Mr. Pennington, the village solicitor, who'd fidgeted similarly when questioned about a missing will. Pride, she thought, could make a man bold, but it could also make him careless. Clara Henshaw was next, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her plain cotton dress creased from the morning's work. Her voice, when she spoke, was soft but clear, with a trace of the local accent that marked her as one of St. Mary Mead's own. "I was at my station, Inspector," she said, her eyes fixed on the carpet. "I was focused on my sponge cake, then the lamb pie. I didn't see anything unusual, and I certainly didn't go near Henri's station." Her fingers twisted together, a small betrayal of nerves, and Miss Marple recalled Clara's mother, whose quiet demeanor had hidden a fierce loyalty to her family. Was Clara's reticence fear or something deeper? Miss Marple made a mental note to speak with her later, perhaps over tea, where confidences flowed more freely. Martin Greaves, the producer, was a bundle of restless energy, his disheveled hair and crumpled shirt at odds with the polished setting. He paced as he spoke, his words tumbling out in a rush. "I was everywhere, Inspector, checking cameras, adjusting lights, keeping the show on track. I didn't have time to notice anything odd, let alone tamper with anyone's ingredients." His hands gestured wildly, but Miss Marple caught a fleeting glance toward the door, as if he longed to escape. She thought of Mr. Hoskins, the grocer, whose nervous chatter had once betrayed his role in a petty theft. Martin's agitation, she suspected, was not just the product of a disrupted production. It hinted at something he wished to conceal. Beatrice Lyle, the final suspect, sat with the poise of a queen, her scarlet jacket a vivid splash against the room's muted tones. Her blonde hair was still impeccable, her expression calm as she met Craddock's gaze. "I was at my own station, perfecting my dishes," she said, her voice smooth as cream. "Henri's collapse was as much a shock to me as to anyone. I was across the room, focused on my work." Her smile was polite, but Miss Marple saw the faintest tightening of her jaw, a sign of strain beneath the composure. She thought of Mrs. Eldridge, whose serene exterior at the village fete had masked a calculating mind. Beatrice's polish, Miss Marple suspected, was a carefully crafted facade, hiding motives yet to be uncovered. Craddock, his notebook filled with their statements, dismissed them to separate rooms under constable supervision, warning them not to leave the manor. He turned to Miss Marple, his expression a mix of frustration and curiosity. "They all claim innocence, but someone's lying," he said. "The bitters bottle is the key, but we won't know more until the lab results come in. Any thoughts, Miss Marple?" She smiled faintly, her needles never pausing. "Only that people are rarely as simple as they seem, Inspector," she replied. "In my village, I once knew a woman who poisoned a rival's jam to win a prize. The method was clever, but her eyes gave her away. Look to their eyes, Inspector, and what they choose not to say." Craddock nodded, accustomed to her cryptic wisdom, and returned to his team. Miss Marple remained in the drawing room, her mind turning over the suspect's words. Sir Reginald's arrogance suggested a man who thrived on control, but had he resented Henri enough to act? Clara's quiet intensity hinted at a past grievance, perhaps tied to her time under Henri's employ. Martin's nervous energy could be the product of a producer's stress, or something more sinister. Ratings, she knew, could be a powerful motive. And Beatrice, with her cool precision, had the air of one who planned every move. Her rivalry with Henri was no secret, but was it enough to drive her to murder? She thought of a village incident years ago, when a seemingly innocuous flower show had ended in sabotage, the culprit revealed by a single careless gesture. Here, the stakes were grander, but the patterns were the same. Jealousy, pride, ambition, all simmering beneath the surface. The bitters bottle, she suspected, was the key, but its placement on Henri's station raised questions. Who had access? Who knew enough to choose a poison that could be masked by its sharp flavor? And why had Henri, so meticulous, not noticed an unfamiliar bottle? Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the studio, visible through the drawing room's glass doors. The constables were still at work, their movements precise but mechanical. She thought of the bottle's cap, slightly askew, and the faint smudge she'd noticed earlier, as if wiped in haste. It was a small detail, but in her experience, small details were the threads that unraveled the tightest knots. She recalled a village seamstress who'd betrayed her guilt by a single dropped needle. Here, the smudge might point to the hand that had wielded the poison. As the afternoon waned, the manor grew quiet, the villagers dispersing and the suspects sequestered. Miss Marple rose, her knitting tucked into her bag, and made her way to the studio's edge, where a constable allowed her a closer look under Craddock's orders. She stood by Henri's station, her eyes tracing the scattered ingredients. The fennel, the saffron, the spilled bisque. The bitters bottle was gone, but its absence was as telling as its presence. She thought of the suspect's movements during the competition, Martin's fleeting pause, Beatrice's proximity, Clara's focus, Sir Reginald's commanding view. One of them, she was certain, had seized a moment to act. Returning to her chair, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her mind as sharp as the needles in her hands. The shadow of suspicion hung over them all, but she knew that truth, like a well-baked loaf, required time to rise. She would watch, listen, and wait, for in St. Mary Mead or a grand manor, the human heart always betrayed itself in the end. Chapter 4. A Pinch of Motive. The manor house, its grandeur softened by the late afternoon light, seemed to hold its breath as the investigation into Henri Dubois's death deepened. The drawing room, where Miss Jane Marple had taken tea with the suspects earlier, now served as a temporary haven for her reflections. The fire in the grate had dwindled to embers, casting a warm glow over the velvet drapes and polished wood, but the air was heavy with unspoken tensions. Outside, the villagers of St. Mary Mead had dispersed, their curiosity sated for the moment, leaving the manor to the constables and the weight of a crime unsolved. Miss Marple, seated in her corner armchair, her knitting bag at her side, sipped her tea with a calm that belied the sharpness of her mind. Her needles clicked softly, a steady rhythm as she pieced together the motives that simmered beneath the suspects' polished facades. Inspector Craddock had retreated to the studio to oversee the forensic team, leaving Miss Marple to her thoughts. She appreciated his diligence, but she knew that motives, like delicate herbs, required a gentler touch to coax them into the open. The suspects, Sir Reginald Hawthorne, Clara Henshaw, Martin Greaves, and Beatrice Lyle, had each presented a version of innocence, but Miss Marple had seen too many village dramas to trust words alone. In St. Mary Mead, she had once unraveled a theft at the church fete by noting the way a woman's hands fidgeted with her scarf. Here, she suspected, the truth lay in similar subtleties. Sir Reginald, the pompous food critic, was her first consideration. His disdain for Henri had been palpable during the competition, his critiques laced with a venom that went beyond professional judgment. Miss Marple recalled his pronouncement on Henri's bouillabaisse, overly ambitious, delivered with a sneer that had made the Frenchman's jaw tighten. Sir Reginald's pride, she mused, was not unlike that of old Mr. Pennington, the village solicitor, who had once sabotaged a rival's garden to preserve his reputation as the finest rose-grower. Sir Reginald's career rested on his authority as a critic, and Henri's bold, modern flavors challenged that authority. Had his pride driven him to eliminate a threat? She thought of the monogrammed cufflinks he'd adjusted so deliberately during his questioning, a gesture that suggested a man who valued appearances above all. Pride, she knew, could be a potent poison when wounded. Clara Henshaw, the local baker, presented a different puzzle. Her quiet intensity during the competition had intrigued Miss Marple, as had the faint tremor in her hands when questioned. Clara's past, she suspected, held the key to her motive. Over tea, Miss Marple had learned from a village friend that Clara had once worked as Henri's sous chef in a prestigious London restaurant, a detail absent from her official biography. The arrangement had ended abruptly, with Clara returning to St. Mary Mead to start her bakery. Had Henri wronged her in some way? Miss Marple thought of Mrs. Carter, a village seamstress who had nursed a grudge against a rival for years after a stolen pattern. Clara's reticence, her flushed cheeks when Sir Reginald dismissed her sponge cake, suggested a deeper wound. Resentment, Miss Marple noted, could fester into something deadly, especially in one who appeared so unassuming. Martin Greaves, the producer, was a more complex case. His nervous energy and disheveled appearance suggested a man stretched thin by the demands of the great culinary clash. Yet Miss Marple had caught the gleam in his eyes when he spoke of the show's soaring viewership after Henri's collapse. She recalled a village grocer, Mr. Hoskins, who had staged a theft to draw attention to his shop, his desperation masked by a flurry of activity. Martin's show, she had overheard from a crew member, was on the brink of cancellation before the tragedy, its ratings languishing. A scandal, particularly one involving a celebrity chef's death, could transform it into a sensation. Had Martin orchestrated the tragedy for profit? His fleeting pause near Henri's station, ostensibly to adjust a light, lingered in Miss Marple's memory. Ambition, she thought, could drive a man to desperate acts, especially when cloaked in chaos. Beatrice Lyle, the polished rival, was the most compelling suspect. Her rivalry with Henri was no secret. The culinary world buzzed with tales of their clashes at previous competitions. Beatrice's molecular gastronomy, innovative but polarizing, had often been overshadowed by Henri's bold, crowd-pleasing dishes. Miss Marple had noted the flicker of resentment in Beatrice's eyes when Henri bantered with the presenter, his charisma stealing the spotlight. She thought of Mrs. Eldridge, whose serene composure at the village fete had hidden a ruthless streak when her roses lost to a rival's. Beatrice's cool precision, her knowledge of obscure ingredients, made her a formidable candidate. Had jealousy driven her to eliminate Henri, ensuring her own ascent? The smudge on the bitters bottle, Miss Marple recalled, suggested a careful hand. Beatrice's, perhaps, accustomed to pipettes and precise measurements. Miss Marple set down her tea, her mind turning to the bitters bottle itself. Its presence on Henri's station was peculiar. Bouillabaisse, even in its most adventurous forms, rarely called for such an ingredient. She recalled a village incident where a poisoned jar of jam had been laced with a bitter herb to mask the taste. Aconite, the suspected poison, was known for its sharp flavor, easily disguised by bitters in a dish as complex as Henri's bisque. Who among the suspects had the knowledge to choose such a method? Beatrice, with her scientific approach, seemed the most likely, but Martin's access to the studio and Clara's culinary experience could not be dismissed. Even Sir Reginald, with his encyclopedic knowledge of flavors, might have known how to mask a poison. She rose, her movements slow but deliberate, and made her way to the studio, where Craddock had permitted her limited access. The constables, recognizing her as the inspector's unofficial ally, allowed her to linger near Henri's station, now cordoned off but still a tableau of tragedy. The spilled bisque had been cleared, but the counter bore traces of fennel and saffron, their aromas faint but lingering. Miss Marple's eyes fell on the spot where the bitters bottle had stood, its absence a silent accusation. She recalled the smudge she'd noticed earlier, a faint mark as if wiped in haste. It was a small detail, but in her experience, small details were the stitches that held a mystery together. She thought of a village baker who'd betrayed her guilt by a single crumb on her apron. Here, the smudge might point to the culprit's hand. Returning to the drawing room, Miss Marple encountered Raymond, who had slipped away from his duties as a production consultant to check on her. "Aunt Jane," he said, his eyes bright with curiosity, "you're already unraveling this, aren't you? I saw the way you watched those suspects." She smiled, her expression mild. "I'm only observing, my dear," she replied, but her mind was elsewhere, piecing together the motives she'd uncovered. Raymond, ever the optimist, pressed her for details, but she demurred, thinking of a village girl who'd once revealed too much too soon and lost her chance at justice. "Patience, Raymond," she said. "The truth, like a good stew, needs time to simmer." As evening fell, the manor grew quiet, the suspects confined to their rooms under Craddock's orders. Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting resumed, her thoughts as intricate as the pattern in her hands. Each suspect had a motive: pride, resentment, ambition, jealousy. But motives alone were not enough. She needed evidence, a thread to pull that would unravel the truth. The bitters bottle, the smudge, the glances exchanged during the competition, these were her clues, small but potent. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where a single misplaced word had once exposed a liar. Here, in the grand manor, the stakes were higher, but the human heart, she knew, was as predictable as ever. Chapter 5. The Ingredients of Deceit. The manor house, its elegance now muted by the shadow of murder, stood sentinel over St. Mary Mead as dusk settled over the village. The studio, once a stage for culinary ambition, was now a crime scene, its gleaming counters cordoned off by police tape, its air heavy with the residue of tragedy. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag slung over her arm, moved through the manor's corridors with the unhurried gait of one accustomed to observing life's subtler currents. The constables, busy with their tasks, paid her little mind, her frail figure and lavender cardigan blending into the background. Yet her eyes, sharp as ever, missed nothing. The flicker of a curtain, the echo of a hurried step, the faint scent of saffron lingering in the hall. Inspector Craddock had granted her permission to linger near the studio, a concession born of respect for her uncanny knack for unraveling mysteries. She had requested a closer look at Henri Dubois's station, ostensibly to refresh her memory, but in truth, she sought the small details that often escaped official notice. The studio was quiet now, save for the occasional murmur of a constable or the scratch of a forensic officer's pen. Miss Marple stood by Henry's station, her gaze sweeping over the counter where the tragedy had unfolded. The spilled bisque had been cleared, but traces of its ingredients remained, a scattering of fennel seeds, a dusting of saffron, and a faint stain where the copper pot had tipped. Her eyes settled on the spot where the bitters bottle had stood, now replaced by a chalk outline marking its absence. The bottle, she knew, was at the laboratory, its contents being tested for aconite, but it was the memory of its cap, slightly askew, with a faint smudge, that held her attention. She leaned closer, careful not to disturb the scene, and noticed a subtle irregularity in the counter's surface, a small, almost imperceptible smear, as if someone had wiped it hastily with a cloth. It was near where the bitters bottle had been, and it struck her as deliberate, the kind of gesture one made to erase a mistake. She thought of Mrs. Carter, the village seamstress, who had once wiped a table too vigorously after spilling ink, betraying her guilt over a stolen pattern. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. The smudge was a clue, however small, and she resolved to keep it in mind. She slipped a handkerchief from her sleeve, using it to shield her hand as she touched the edge of a nearby vial of olive oil, its label pristine, but its cap slightly loose. Another anomaly, she noted, for Henri had been meticulous in his craft. Had someone tampered with his ingredients, or was this merely the chaos of a busy kitchen? Stepping back, Miss Marple surveyed the studio as a whole. The other stations, Clara's with its neat rows of baking tins, and Beatrice's, a clutter of pipettes and scientific tools, stood in stark contrast to Henri's disarray. She recalled the morning's events. Martin Greaves's fleeting pause near Henri's station, ostensibly to adjust a light, Beatrice's measured movements, her station close enough to Henri's for a discreet act, Clara's intense focus, her eyes rarely straying from her work, and Sir Reginald's commanding view from the judging table, his presence a constant pressure. Each had opportunity, she mused, but opportunity was only one ingredient. Motive and method were the others, and she needed more to discern the recipe of this crime. Returning to the manor's drawing room, Miss Marple settled into her armchair. Her knitting resumed as a cover for her thoughts. She had arranged to meet Dr. Haydock, an old friend from the village, whose medical expertise she often relied upon in such matters. He arrived promptly, his weathered face creased with concern, as he sat opposite her, a cup of tea in hand. "A bad business, Jane," he said, his voice low. "Craddock tells me it's aconite, likely in that bitters bottle. Nasty stuff, tasteless in small doses but deadly. It could have been mixed with anything sharp enough to mask it." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking steadily. "Such as bitters?" she prompted, her tone mild but probing. Dr. Haydock raised an eyebrow. Exactly. A chef like Dubois wouldn't notice a slight bitterness in a dish as complex as his bisque. Whoever did this knew their flavors. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes bright with interest. And the bottle itself, Doctor. Could it have been tampered with during the competition without drawing attention? Dr. Haydock considered this, stroking his chin. Easily, I'd say. The studio was a madhouse. Cameras, crew, contestants all moving about. A quick sleight of hand, a moment's distraction, and it's done. The trick is knowing what to use and when. Miss Marple nodded, thinking of a village fete where a poisoned jar of jam had been slipped into a display during a moment's chaos. The bitters bottle, she suspected, had been chosen for its inconspicuousness, a detail only a culinary mind would appreciate. She thanked Dr. Haydock, who left to consult with Craddock, and turned her attention to the suspect's movements during the competition. Martin Greaves had been near Henri's station, his nervous energy a perfect cover for a discreet act. Beatrice, with her scientific precision, would know how to handle a poison like aconite, perhaps even disguising it in a vial of her own. Clara, though focused, had the culinary knowledge to choose a masking agent, and her proximity to Henri's station made her a candidate. Sir Reginald, from his elevated table, seemed the least likely to have acted directly, but his influence could have orchestrated something subtler. Miss Marple recalled a village squire who had manipulated a servant into sabotaging a rival's wine. Power, she knew, could work through proxies. Her thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of Raymond, her nephew, who slipped into the drawing room with a grin. "Aunt Jane, you're deep in it, aren't you?" he said, settling into a chair. "I've been eavesdropping on the crew, plenty of gossip about our suspects. Did you know Clara worked for Henri years ago? Left in a huff, apparently, and Beatrice, well, she's been gunning for him since he beat her in Paris." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her needles never pausing. "Gossip, Raymond, is like a half-baked loaf, useful but incomplete. What else did you hear?" He leaned forward, his voice conspiratorial. "Martin's show was on its last legs before this happened. Now it's the talk of the nation. Funny how tragedy sells, isn't it?" Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning over this new ingredient. Martin's desperation for ratings was a motive she had considered, but Raymond's tidbit added weight. She thought of Mr. Hoskins, the grocer, whose staged theft had drawn crowds to his shop. Martin's glance toward Henri's station, his nervous energy, took on a new significance. Yet Beatrice's rivalry, fueled by years of defeat, was equally compelling. And Clara's past with Henri, had it left a scar deep enough to drive her to murder? Sir Reginald's disdain, too, could not be dismissed. Pride, wounded by a chef's defiance, might seek a permanent solution. She rose, her movements deliberate, and made her way back to the studio, where a constable stood guard. "Just a moment, if you please," she said, her voice soft but firm. The young man, recognizing her as Craddock's ally, stepped aside, allowing her to approach Henri's station once more. She stood by the counter, her eyes tracing the chalk outline of the bitters bottle. The smudge, she noted, was near a small bowl of saffron, its vibrant threads scattered as if disturbed. Had someone reached for the bottle in haste, brushing against the bowl? She thought of Beatrice's precise movements, Martin's nervous fumbling, Clara's steady hands. The smudge, she decided, was a thread worth pulling. Returning to the drawing room, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her mind as intricate as the pattern in her hands. The ingredients of deceit were coming into focus. A bottle out of place, a smudge betraying haste, a poison chosen for its subtlety. She thought of Saint Mary Mead, where a single misplaced word had once exposed a liar. Here, in the grand manor, the stakes were higher, but the human heart was the same: jealous, proud, ambitious, and, in one case, deadly. She would need to tread carefully, for the truth, like a delicate soufflé, required patience to rise without collapsing. Chapter 6. A Taste of the Past. The manor house, its grandeur softened by the deepening twilight, seemed to cradle its secrets as tightly as the velvet curtains that framed the drawing-room's windows. The fire in the grate cast a warm, flickering glow, but the air was heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her familiar armchair, her knitting bag at her side, sipped her tea with a calm that masked the sharpness of her observations. The studio, now a silent monument to Henri Dubois's final moments, lay beyond the glass doors, its gleaming counters still cordoned by police tape. The constables moved with quiet efficiency, their voices low, but Miss Marple's attention was fixed on the human drama, unfolding closer at hand. She had arranged a private tea with Clara Henshaw, sensing that the baker's quiet intensity held a key to the mystery. The invitation, facilitated by a production assistant who owed her a favor from a past village intrigue, was a chance to probe the past, to stir the pot of memory and see what flavors rose to the surface. Clara entered the drawing room, her plain cotton dress creased from the day's ordeal, her tightly pinned bun giving her an air of restraint that contrasted with the tremor in her hands. She sat opposite Miss Marple, her eyes fixed on the teacup she clutched, as if it were an anchor in a storm. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice soft but tinged with the local accent of St. Mary Mead. "I'm grateful you asked me here. This business with Henri, it's dreadful, and I'm afraid of being caught up in it." Her words were polite, but Miss Marple caught the faint quiver in her tone, an echo of the tension she'd noticed during the competition. She thought of Mrs. Carter, the village seamstress, whose nervous fidgeting had once betrayed a hidden theft. Clara, she suspected, carried a similar burden, one that needed only a gentle nudge to reveal itself. "My dear," Miss Marple said, her voice as soothing as the tea's warmth, "there's no need to fear. A cup of tea can do wonders for the nerves, and I find it often helps one recall things clearly. You knew Henri Dubois before this competition, didn't you?" Her tone was gentle, but her eyes were sharp, watching Clara's reaction. The baker's hands tightened around her cup, and a faint flush crept up her cheeks. "Yes," she admitted, her voice barely above the fire's crackle. "I worked for him years ago, in London. I was his sous chef at Le Cygne, his restaurant. It didn't end well." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking softly as she resumed her knitting. "It's a hard thing, working under someone with such a strong personality," she said, her tone inviting confidence. "In my village, I knew a young woman who worked for a demanding dressmaker. She poured her heart into her stitches, only to see her work claimed by another. It left a mark, didn't it?" Clara's eyes met hers, a flicker of recognition passing between them. "It did," she said, her voice steadier now, as if the memory had been coaxed into the open. "Henri was brilliant, but he was ruthless. I created recipes, pastries, sauces, things I'd spent months perfecting. He took them, presented them as his own, and I got nothing but a paycheck and his temper. I left after a year, came back here to start my bakery. I thought I'd put it behind me." Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind turning over Clara's words. The bitterness in her voice was subtle, like a pinch of salt in a rich broth, but it was there, unmistakable. She thought of a village baker who had once sabotaged a rival's bread at a fete, driven by a similar sense of betrayal. "That must have been painful," she said, her voice gentle but probing. "To see your work celebrated, but not your name. Did it make you angry, Clara?" The baker's hands trembled slightly, and she set her cup down with care. "I hated him," she admitted, her voice low but fierce. "But I'd never kill him, Miss Marple. I poured my anger into my bakery, into proving I was better than he thought. I didn't need to poison him to win." Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of quiet sympathy. But her mind was alert. Clara's confession was a crack in the facade, revealing a motive as potent as any poison. Yet her denial rang true, her eyes holding a sincerity that Miss Marple recognized from countless village confessions. She thought of Mrs. Carter again, whose theft had been born of desperation, not malice. Was Clara's hatred enough to push her to murder, or was it merely a wound that had scarred over? "Of course, my dear," Miss Marple said, her tone soothing. "But sometimes the past has a way of stirring things up, doesn't it? Like spices in a dish left too long in the cupboard." Clara's lips twitched, a faint smile breaking through her tension. "You sound like my mother," she said, her voice softening. "She always said I held on to things too tightly." Miss Marple smiled back, her needles resuming their rhythm. "Mothers often see us clearly," she said. "Tell me, Clara, during the competition, did you notice anything unusual near Henry's station? A bottle, perhaps, that didn't belong?" Clara's eyes widened slightly, and she shook her head. "I was too focused on my pie," she said. "I didn't see anything, I swear." Her hands trembled again, and Miss Marple noted the gesture, filing it away like a recipe card. Clara's denial was firm, but her nerves suggested something unspoken, a memory perhaps too painful to share. As Clara left, her steps hesitant, Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind simmering with new ingredients. Clara's past with Henri was a potent motive, but her sincerity suggested innocence, or a well-practiced facade. Miss Marple turned her attention to the other suspects, her thoughts drifting to a conversation she'd had with Raymond earlier that day. He had lingered in the Manor's hall, his writer's curiosity piqued by the gossip swirling among the crew. "Aunt Jane," he'd said, his voice low with excitement. "I heard something about Beatrice Lyle. She and Henri had a falling out years ago at a competition in Paris. She accused him of sabotaging her dish, some sort of tampering with her ingredients. The judges dismissed it, but it cost her a big endorsement. She's never forgiven him." Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes narrowing. Beatrice's rivalry with Henri was well known, but this detail added a new flavor to the mix. She recalled Mrs. Eldridge, whose serene composure at the village fete had hidden a ruthless streak when her roses lost to a rival's. Beatrice's cool precision, her scientific approach to cooking, made her a formidable candidate for a calculated crime. Had she tampered with Henri's bitters bottle, using her knowledge of chemistry to mask the poison? The smudge on the bottle, Miss Marple remembered, suggested a careful hand, one accustomed to precision. Beatrice's station, with its pipettes and vials, was a laboratory of possibilities. Yet there was more to consider. Raymond had also mentioned a snippet about Martin Greaves, the producer, whose show was teetering on the edge of cancellation before Henri's death. "The crew says he's been frantic," Raymond had confided. "This tragedy has sent the ratings through the roof. Funny how a death can save a show, isn't it?" Miss Marple had nodded, thinking of Mr. Hoskins, the grocer, whose staged theft had drawn crowds to his shop. Martin's nervous energy, his fleeting pause near Henri's station, took on a darker hue. Could he have orchestrated the tragedy for profit, slipping aconite into the bitters during a moment's chaos? Sir Reginald Hawthorne, too, remained a puzzle. His disdain for Henri had been evident, his critiques sharp enough to cut. Miss Marple recalled his monogrammed cufflinks, adjusted with such deliberation during his questioning. She thought of a village squire who had once manipulated a servant into sabotaging a rival's wine, his pride too great to tolerate a challenge. Sir Reginald's authority as a critic was threatened by Henri's defiance. Had he acted to preserve his dominance? His elevated position at the judging table gave him a clear view of the studio. But did it also give him opportunity? Miss Marple set her cup down, her needles clicking as she turned the thought over in her mind. The past, she knew, was a potent ingredient, flavoring the present with its bitter residues. Clara's grudge, Beatrice's rivalry, Martin's desperation, Sir Reginald's pride. Each was a spice in the soup of this crime. The bitters bottle, with its smudge and misplaced cap, was the vessel. But the hand that stirred it remained elusive. She thought of a village incident where a poisoned jar of jam had been traced to a single careless gesture. Here, the smudge was her clue, a thread to pull in the tapestry of deceit. As the fire dwindled, Miss Marple rose, her knitting tucked into her bag. The manor was quiet now, the suspects in their rooms, the constables at their posts. She would need to speak with the others, to taste their stories and sift their truths. The drawing room, with its wood smoke and velvet, was a stage for a drama that had begun long before the cameras rolled. Clara's confession was a beginning, but the recipe for murder was far from complete. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed, her mind as sharp as her needles, ready to unravel the next thread in the mystery of Henri Dubois' death. Chapter 7. The Producer's Plot. The manor house, its stately silhouette softened by the creeping shadows of evening, stood as a silent witness to the tragedy that had unfolded within its walls. The drawing room, where Miss Jane Marple had sipped tea with Clara Henshaw only hours before, now felt like a stage awaiting its next act. The fire in the grate burned low, its embers casting a faint glow over the polished mahogany and heavy velvet curtains. Outside, the village of St. Mary Mead had settled into a hushed quiet, the earlier buzz of gossip replaced by the somber weight of a murder unsolved. Miss Marple, her knitting bag at her side, stood by the window, her eyes tracing the manor's gardens, where the last light of day lingered on the roses. Her needles lay still in her lap, a rare pause as her mind stirred the ingredients of the case, motives, opportunities, and the faint smudge on a bitters bottle that hinted at a careful hand. Inspector Craddock and his constables were still at work in the studio, their voices a low murmur through the glass doors. The bitters bottle, now in the laboratory, was the key to Henri Dubois's death, its contents likely laced with aconite, a poison as subtle as it was deadly. Miss Marple had learned from Dr. Haydock that such a poison could be masked by the sharp tang of bitters, a choice that suggested a mind well versed in flavors, or deception. Her thoughts turned to Martin Greaves, the producer, whose nervous energy and disheveled appearance had caught her attention from the start. His fleeting pause near Henri's station, his gleaming eyes when speaking of the show's soaring ratings, lingered in her memory like a bitter aftertaste. She recalled Mr. Hoskins, the village grocer, whose staged theft had drawn crowds to his shop. Martin, she suspected, might have orchestrated a far darker scheme. She had arranged to meet Martin in the Manor's library, a quieter setting than the drawing room, where the shelves of leather-bound books and the scent of old paper might loosen his guard. The invitation was facilitated by Raymond, who had charmed a production assistant into arranging the meeting. Miss Marple entered the library, her steps soft on the Persian rug, and found Martin pacing near a tall window, a cigarette dangling from his fingers. His wiry frame seemed taut with tension, his shirt more crumpled than ever, and his eyes darted to her with a mix of irritation and unease. "Miss Marple," he said, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "I'm not sure what you want with me. I've told the inspector everything. Running a show like this doesn't leave time for noticing much else." Miss Marple settled into a high-backed chair, her knitting bag at her feet, her expression one of mild curiosity. "Of course, Mr. Greaves," she said, her voice as gentle as a summer breeze. "It must be a dreadful strain, managing such a spectacle. In my village, I knew a man who ran the annual fete, always rushing about, yet he saw more than he led on. You were everywhere during the competition, weren't you?" Her tone was conversational, but her eyes were sharp, watching the way his fingers twitched around the cigarette. Martin stubbed it out in a crystal ashtray, his movements jerky. "Everywhere, yes," he said, his voice clipped. "Cameras, lights, sound. My job's to keep it all moving. I didn't have time to meddle with anyone's station, if that's what you're getting at." Miss Marple's needles began their familiar click, a soothing rhythm that belied the precision of her probing. "I wouldn't dream of suggesting such a thing," she said, her smile disarming. "But I did notice you near Henri's station, adjusting a light, I believe. It was just before his collapse. A busy man like you must see things others miss." Martin's eyes narrowed, and he ran a hand through his disheveled hair. "I was checking a rig," he said, his voice rising slightly. "The lighting was off, too much glare on the seafood. I didn't touch his ingredients, Miss Marple. I'm a producer, not a chef." His words were firm, but his hands betrayed him, fidgeting with the edge of his sleeve. She thought of Mr. Hoskins again, whose nervous chatter had masked a guilty conscience. "And yet," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but persistent, "a producer sees the whole stage, doesn't he? Like a conductor, watching every player. You must have noticed something, someone near Henri's station, perhaps, or a bottle that seemed out of place." Martin's face tightened, and he paced to the window, his back to her. "It was chaos," he said, his voice low. "Contestants, crew, cameras, I can't watch everyone. I didn't see anything unusual." But his shoulders stiffened, and Miss Marple noted the way he avoided her gaze, as if shielding a truth too bitter to share. She recalled a village shopkeeper who had denied seeing a theft, only to reveal his complicity through a single averted glance. Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes gleaming with quiet intensity. "It's curious, isn't it?" she said, "how a tragedy can change a show's fortunes. I heard the great culinary clash was struggling before Henri's death. Now I imagine the world is watching." Martin spun around, his face flushed. "That's a vile thing to suggest," he snapped, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of calculation. "The show was fine, struggling maybe, but we'd have pulled through. Henry's death is a disaster, not a windfall." His voice was indignant, but Miss Marple caught the gleam in his eyes, the same one she'd seen when he spoke of ratings. She thought of a village fete organizer who had once staged a minor scandal to draw crowds. Martin's desperation, she suspected, was a potent ingredient in this crime. She changed tack, her voice as gentle as ever. "Of course, Mr. Greaves, I meant no offense, but you must have known Henri well, working so closely with him. Did he have enemies among the crew, perhaps, or the other contestants?" Martin hesitated, his fingers twitching again. "Henri was difficult," he admitted. "Arrogant, always demanding better angles, more screen time. He clashed with Sir Reginald constantly. The judge hated his modern nonsense. And Beatrice, well, everyone knows they were rivals. But I didn't see anything specific, Miss Marple. I was too busy keeping the show on track." His words were careful, but his eyes darted to the door, as if longing to escape. Miss Marple noted the gesture, filing it away like a recipe card. As Martin left, his steps hurried. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her mind simmering with new flavors. Martin's nervous energy, his proximity to Henri's station, and his evasiveness suggested more than a producer's stress. The show's precarious state, now bolstered by scandal, was a motive as compelling as Clara's grudge or Beatrice's rivalry. She thought of Raymond's gossip about the show's cancellation fears, confirmed by a crew member's whisper in the hall. Martin's pause near the bitters bottle, his claim of adjusting a light, took on a darker hue. Had he slipped aconite into the bottle, knowing the cameras would capture the drama? She recalled a village incident where a staged accident had drawn attention to a failing shop. Martin, she suspected, might have seen Henri's death as a recipe for success. Yet the other suspects could not be dismissed. Clara's confession of her past with Henri revealed a deep wound, but her sincerity suggested innocence, or a masterful performance. Beatrice's rivalry, fueled by years of defeat, made her a candidate for a calculated act, her scientific precision perfect for handling a poison like aconite. Sir Reginald's pride, wounded by Henri's defiance, might have driven him to act through a proxy, his elevated position offering a clear view of the studio's chaos. The smudge on the bitters bottle, Miss Marple mused, was the key. A careless gesture in a moment of haste. Martin's nervous hands, Beatrice's meticulous ones, Clara's trembling ones, or Sir Reginald's steady ones. Which had left the mark? She rose, her knitting tucked into her bag, and made her way to the studio's edge, where a constable stood guard. "Just a moment, if you please," she said, her voice soft but firm. The young man, recognizing her as Craddock's ally, stepped aside, allowing her to survey Henri's station once more. The chalk outline of the bitters bottle was stark against the counter, but her eyes were drawn to a nearby tray, where a scattering of fennel seeds lay undisturbed. Had someone brushed against it in haste, or was it merely the chaos of the competition? She thought of a village baker who had betrayed her guilt by a single misplaced crumb. Here, the seeds might point to the hand that stirred the poison. Returning to the library, Miss Marple sat by the window, her needles clicking as she turned the thought over in her mind. The producer's plot was a potent ingredient, but the recipe for murder was incomplete. Martin's desperation, Clara's grudge, Beatrice's jealousy, Sir Reginald's pride. Each was a spice in the broth, but the smudge, the bottle, the moment of deceit tied them together. She thought of Saint Mary Mead, where a single careless word had once exposed a liar. Here, in the Manor's grand library, the truth was simmering, and Miss Marple's sharp eyes were ready to taste it. Chapter 8. The Judge's Disdain. The Manor House, its stately halls now cloaked in the stillness of late evening, seemed to guard its secrets as jealously as the oak-paneled walls of its dining room. The fire in the grate had burned to a soft glow, casting long shadows that danced across the portraits of stern-faced ancestors, their eyes seeming to follow the movements of the living. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag tucked beside her, sat at the polished dining table, a glass of sherry in her hand, her frail figure a deceptive contrast to the sharpness of her mind. The studio, beyond the Manor's heavy doors, remained a sealed vault, its gleaming counters and scattered ingredients a silent testament to Henri Dubois's final moments. The constables, under Inspector Craddock's diligent command, continued their meticulous work, but Miss Marple's focus was on the human drama unfolding within the Manor's walls. Sir Reginald Hawthorne, the imperious food critic, had agreed to meet her for a late sherry, though his agreement was tinged with a condescension that bordered on disdain. Miss Marple had orchestrated the meeting through a subtle appeal to his vanity, suggesting that his expertise as a judge might shed light on the tragedy. Raymond, her nephew, had smoothed the way with a word to the production team, framing the request as a matter of respect for Sir Reginald's authority. The dining room, with its crystal chandelier and silver candelabra, was a fitting stage for such a man, and Miss Marple knew that flattery, like a well-placed garnish, could loosen even the tightest lips. Sir Reginald entered, his tailored suit impeccable, despite the day's turmoil, his florid face set in a mask of self-assured authority. He carried a monogrammed handkerchief, which he adjusted with a flourish as he sat, his gold fountain pen gleaming in his breast pocket. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice rich with the cadence of one accustomed to being heard, "I'm not sure what an elderly lady from a village can hope to uncover in this sordid affair, but I'll humor you. I've told Inspector Craddock all I know. I was at the judging table, tasting dishes, not meddling with contestants' stations." His tone was dismissive, but Miss Marple's eyes caught the faint tremor in his hand as he poured his sherry, a gesture that reminded her of Colonel Bantry, whose bluster had often masked unease. She smiled, her expression one of mild deference, her knitting needles clicking softly as she drew them from her bag. "Of course, Sir Reginald," she said, her voice as gentle as the sherry's warmth. "Your position as judge gave you a unique perspective, didn't it? Like a vicar in my village, watching the congregation from the pulpit. You must have seen everything, the contestants, the crew, the little details that others miss." Her words were a delicate probe, and Sir Reginald's lips curled slightly, flattered despite himself. "I see more than most," he admitted, sipping his sherry. "My role demands it. Dubois' theatrics were tiresome, but I had no reason to interfere with his work. My critiques were honest. His flavors were vulgar, too bold for a refined palate." Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes gleaming with quiet intensity. "Vulgar," she repeated, her tone thoughtful. "A strong word, Sir Reginald. In my village, I knew a man who called a rival's roses vulgar, then went to great lengths to ensure they never bloomed again. Your critiques of Henri were quite sharp, weren't they? Almost personal. Sir Reginald's face reddened, and he set his glass down with a clink. Personal? Nonsense, he said, his voice rising. I judge the dish, not the man. Dubois' bouillabaisse was an assault on the senses, saffron overpowering the fish, a schoolboy's error. I said so, and I stand by it. His hand adjusted his handkerchief again, and Miss Marple noted the gesture, recalling the smudge on the bitters bottle, wiped as if in haste. Was it coincidence, or a thread worth pulling? She leaned forward slightly, her voice soft but persistent. Of course, Sir Reginald, your expertise is unquestioned, but during the competition, you were at the judging table, overlooking the studio. Did you notice anyone near Henri's station? Someone who might have touched his ingredients? Perhaps a bottle of bitters? Sir Reginald's eyes narrowed, and he leaned back, his fingers drumming on the table. I was focused on the dishes, he said, his tone clipped. The studio was a circus, cameras, crew, contestants all scurrying about. I didn't see anything unusual, and I certainly didn't go near Dubois' station myself. His words were firm, but his hand strayed to his handkerchief again, a nervous tick that Miss Marple filed away like a recipe card. She changed tack, her tone as soothing as ever. It must be trying, judging such strong personalities, she said. Henri's defiance, for instance, his modern techniques clashing with your traditional tastes. It must have felt like a challenge to your authority. Sir Reginald's jaw tightened, and he took a sharp sip of sherry. He was an upstart, he admitted, his voice low but venomous. He thought his flashy dishes could redefine cuisine, but he lacked discipline, respect for the classics. I put him in his place, as was my duty. His eyes gleamed with a flicker of triumph, and Miss Marple thought of a village squire who had once sabotaged a rival's wine to preserve his reputation. Pride, she knew, could be a poison as deadly as aconite. "Did you ever speak with Henri outside the competition?" she asked, her needles clicking steadily. "Perhaps about his methods, his ambitions." Sir Reginald snorted, his hand waving dismissively. "Speak with him? Hardly. He was all bluster, no substance. I had no reason to engage with him beyond my critiques." But his fingers tightened around his handkerchief, and Miss Marple's sharp eyes caught the monogram, a bold R in gold thread, similar to the smudge on the bitters bottle. She recalled a village incident where a monogrammed scarf had betrayed a thief. Here, the handkerchief might be a clue, however small. As Sir Reginald rose to leave, his posture stiff with irritation, Miss Marple's mind simmered with new flavors. His disdain for Henri was more than professional. It was personal, a wound to his pride that festered beneath his polished exterior. The handkerchief, adjusted so deliberately, was a thread she could not ignore. Had he slipped aconite into the bitters bottle during a moment's chaos, using his authority to mask his actions? She thought of Clara's grudge, Martin's desperation, and Beatrice's jealousy, each a potent ingredient. But Sir Reginald's pride was a spice that burned brightly. His position at the judging table gave him a clear view, but had it also given him opportunity? She made her way to the studio's edge, where a constable stood guard, his face weary from the long day. "Just a moment, if you please," she said, her voice soft but firm. The young man, recognizing her as Craddock's ally, stepped aside, allowing her to survey Henri's station once more. The chalk outline of the bitters bottle was stark against the counter, but her eyes were drawn to a nearby tray of utensils, where a small cloth lay folded, its edge faintly stained. Had someone used it to wipe the bottle, leaving the smudge she'd noticed? She thought of Sir Reginald's handkerchief, its monogram a silent accusation. The cloth, she noted, was unmarked, but its placement suggested haste, a gesture to conceal a mistake. Returning to the dining room, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her needles clicking as she turned the thought over in her mind. Sir Reginald's disdain was a potent motive, but the recipe for murder required more: opportunity, method, and a hand steady enough to act unnoticed. The smudge, the handkerchief, the cloth, all were threads in a tapestry of deceit. She thought of Saint Mary Mead, where a single misplaced word had once exposed a liar. Here, in the Manor's grand dining room, the truth was simmering, and Miss Marple's sharp eyes were ready to taste its bitterness. Chapter 9. The Rival's Edge. The manor house, its ancient stones steeped in the quiet of a St. Mary Mead night, seemed to hold its breath as the investigation into Henri Dubois's death deepened. The grand halls, once alive with the clatter of culinary ambition, now echoed with the soft tread of constables and the murmur of suspicion. Beyond the manor's walls, the village slept, its usual tranquility disturbed only by the occasional whisper of gossip drifting from the Green Dragon pub. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag slung over her arm, stood in the manor's rose garden, where the scent of late blooms mingled with the crisp night air. The garden, bathed in moonlight, was a place of quiet beauty. But Miss Marple's thoughts were far from serene. Her needles lay still in her bag, her mind stirring the ingredients of the case: a smudged bitters bottle, a monogrammed handkerchief, and the sharp edge of rivalry that had sliced through the competition. The studio, sealed and silent, remained a tableau of tragedy, but Miss Marple had requested a meeting with Beatrice Lyle, the final suspect, in the garden's gazebo. The setting, suggested by Raymond's diplomatic nudge to the production team, was deliberate, a place where the formality of the manor might give way to candor. Beatrice, with her polished exterior and calculated precision, was a formidable figure, her rivalry with Henri a well-known thread in the culinary world's tapestry. Miss Marple had heard from Raymond of a past clash in Paris, where Beatrice's accusation of sabotage had cost her dearly. The smudge on the bitters bottle, the choice of aconite, pointed to a hand skilled in subtlety, and Beatrice's scientific approach to cooking made her a compelling candidate. Beatrice arrived, her scarlet jacket replaced by a sleek black coat that seemed to absorb the moonlight. Her blonde hair, still immaculate, gleamed faintly, and her movements were as precise as ever, like a dancer stepping onto a stage. She carried a small pruning knife, which she used to trim a stray rose stem with unnerving accuracy, her eyes flicking to Miss Marple with a mix of curiosity and wariness. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice smooth as velvet, "I'm surprised you'd seek me out here, in the dark. I've told the inspector all I know. I was at my station, focused on my dishes. I had no part in Henri's tragedy." Her words were polished, but Miss Marple caught the faint tightening of her grip on the knife, a gesture that recalled Mrs. Eldridge, whose serene pruning at the village fete had masked a ruthless intent. Miss Marple settled onto a wrought-iron bench, her knitting bag at her side, her expression one of mild interest. "Of course, Miss Lyle," she said, her voice as gentle as the night breeze. "I'm only an old woman, curious about the ways of your world. In my village, I knew a lady who grew roses with such care, but she'd stop at nothing to outshine her rival. Your work with molecular gastronomy, it's a marvel, isn't it? So precise, like a chemist's. Beatrice's lips curved into a faint smile, flattered despite herself. It's a science, yes, she said, setting the pruning knife down. Cooking is about control, every element measured, every outcome planned. Henri, though, he relied on flair, not precision. It cost him in the end. Her tone was neutral, but her eyes held a flicker of something sharper, a glint Miss Marple recognized from countless village rivalries. She drew her needles from her bag, their click a soft counterpoint to the garden's stillness. "Precision is a rare gift," she said, her tone conversational but probing. It must have been galling, seeing Henri's flair win time and again. I heard about Paris, a competition where you felt he played unfairly. That must have left a bitter taste. Beatrice's smile faltered, and she leaned against the gazebo's rail, her fingers tracing its edge. "Paris was a lifetime ago," she said, her voice cool but strained. "He tampered with my equipment. My sous vide machine failed mid-dish. I couldn't prove it, and the judges dismissed me. It cost me a contract with a major sponsor. But I moved on, Miss Marple. I don't dwell on the past." Her words were measured, but her eyes betrayed a spark of resentment, like an ember buried in ash. Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes gleaming with quiet intensity. "The past has a way of lingering," she said, "like a spice in a dish, too strong to ignore. During the competition, you were near Henri's station, weren't you? Adjusting your own ingredients, perhaps, but close enough to notice his." Beatrice's jaw tightened, and she crossed her arms, her posture defensive. "I was focused on my salmon sphere," she said, her voice firm. "I didn't go near his station, and I didn't touch his bitters bottle, if that's what you're implying." Her denial was swift, but Miss Marple noted the way her fingers clenched, a gesture that echoed Mrs. Eldridge's tight grip on her shears when questioned about her roses. She changed tack, her voice as soothing as ever. "Of course, my dear. I'm only trying to understand. A bottle of bitters in a bouillabaisse. It's unusual, isn't it? You, with your knowledge of flavors, must have found it curious." Beatrice's eyes narrowed, and she hesitated, as if weighing her response. "It was odd," she admitted, her voice low. "Henri was traditional in his way. Saffron, fennel, those were his staples. Bitters aren't typical for a bisque, but I was too busy to think about it." Her words were careful, but Miss Marple caught the flicker of calculation in her eyes, as if she knew more than she let on. She thought of a village chemist who had once slipped a bitter herb into a rival's tonic, his precision masking his intent. "Did you ever speak with Henri about your rivalry?" Miss Marple asked, her needles clicking steadily. "Perhaps a chance to clear the air?" Beatrice's lips curled into a faint, bitter smile. "Clear the air? Henri didn't clear things. He dominated them. He reveled in beating me, in taking what I'd earned. But I didn't need to talk to him, Miss Marple. I let my dishes speak for me." Her voice was sharp, and her hand strayed to the pruning knife, a gesture so fleeting it might have gone unnoticed. But Miss Marple's eyes were sharp, and she recalled the smudge on the bitters bottle, wiped as if in haste. Beatrice's precision, her familiarity with obscure ingredients, made her a candidate for such a subtle act. As Beatrice turned to leave, her steps measured but swift, Miss Marple's mind simmered with new flavors. Beatrice's rivalry was a potent motive, her resentment a spice that burned beneath her cool exterior. The pruning knife, handled with such care, echoed the precision needed to tamper with a bottle unnoticed. Yet the other suspects remained in the mix: Clara's grudge, Martin's desperation, Sir Reginald's pride. The smudge on the bitter's bottle, the choice of aconite, pointed to a hand skilled in subtlety, and Beatrice's scientific mind fit the recipe. But was it too perfect a fit? Miss Marple thought of a village fate where a too obvious clue had masked a subtler truth. She made her way to the studio's edge, where a constable stood guard, his face pale in the moonlight. "Just a moment, if you please," she said, her voice soft but firm. The young man, accustomed to her presence, stepped aside, allowing her to survey Henri's station once more. The chalk outline of the bitter's bottle was stark, but her eyes were drawn to a nearby vial, its label smudged as if handled carelessly. Had Beatrice, in her precision, made a rare mistake? Or was the smudge a deliberate misdirection, like a village seamstress's dropped needle that had once pointed to a thief? Returning to the gazebo, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her needles clicking as she turned the thought over in her mind. Beatrice's edge was sharp, her motive clear, but the recipe for murder required more: opportunity, method, and a moment of unseen action. The smudge, the vial, the pruning knife, all were threads in a tapestry of deceit. She thought of Saint Mary Mead, where a single misplaced glance had once exposed a liar. Here, in the manor's moonlit garden, the truth was simmering, and Miss Marple's sharp eyes were ready to taste its bitterness. Chapter 10. The Final Course. The manor house, its ancient stones bathed in the pale light of a St. Mary Mead dawn, stood as a silent sentinel over the unfolding drama of Henri Dubois's murder. The grand halls, once vibrant with the clatter of culinary ambition, now echoed with the measured steps of Inspector Craddock's constables, their voices hushed as they guarded the sealed studio. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of dew from the gardens, but within the manor's walls, the atmosphere was heavy with the weight of secrets on the verge of being unveiled. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag slung over her arm, sat in the manor's morning room, a cozy space with chintz curtains and a low table set for breakfast. Her needles clicked softly, a steady rhythm that belied the sharpness of her mind as she pieced together the final threads of the case. The smudge on the bitter's bottle, the monogrammed handkerchief, the pruning knife. Each was a clue, a spice in the recipe of deceit that had led to Henri's death. Inspector Craddock had summoned Miss Marple early that morning, his face lined with fatigue, but bright with the promise of progress. The laboratory results had confirmed aconite in the bitter's bottle, its sharp tang masked by the complex flavors of Henri's bisque. The smudge on the bottle, analyzed with care, had revealed traces of silk fibers, monogrammed with a distinctive B in gold thread, a clue that pointed unmistakably to Beatrice Lyle. Yet Miss Marple, ever cautious, knew that clues could be as deceptive as a perfectly plated dish hiding a bitter core. She had seen too many village intrigues resolved by a single misplaced gesture to trust so obvious a sign without testing it. The morning room, with its soft light and quiet intimacy, was the perfect setting for her final move, a reenactment of the competition orchestrated with Craddock's reluctant approval to stir the pot and see what truths bubbled to the surface. The suspects, Sir Reginald Hawthorne, Clara Henshaw, Martin Greaves, and Beatrice Lyle, were summoned to the studio under the pretense of reconstructing the fateful moments before Henri's collapse. The constables had cleared the space, leaving only the contestants' stations intact, their ingredients replaced with harmless substitutes to avoid further risk. Miss Marple stood at the edge of the studio, her lavender cardigan blending into the background, her eyes sharp as she watched the suspects take their places. Sir Reginald, his florid face set in a scowl, stood at the judging table, his monogrammed handkerchief tucked into his pocket. Clara, her hands still trembling slightly, positioned herself at her station, her eyes fixed on the flour-dusted counter. Martin, his wiry frame taut with nervous energy, darted glances at the cameras, now dormant but still looming. Beatrice, her scarlet jacket replaced by a crisp white one, moved with her usual precision, her face a mask of composure that Miss Marple knew concealed a deeper tension. Craddock addressed the group, his voice firm but measured. "We're here to retrace your movements," he said, his notebook in hand. "Each of you will recreate your actions during the second round, when the bitters bottle was likely tampered with. Miss Marple believes this may jog your memories or reveal something overlooked." His glance at Miss Marple was one of grudging respect, and she inclined her head, her needles clicking softly in her bag. She had planted a decoy, a replica of the bitters bottle filled with harmless bitters, placed on Henry's station with a faint smudge on its rim, designed to mirror the original. The trap was subtle, like a village baker's sleight of hand at a fete, and Miss Marple watched closely to see who would take the bait. Sir Reginald began, his movements deliberate as he mimicked tasting a dish from Clara's station. "I remained here," he declared, his voice booming with authority. "I had no reason to approach Dubois' station, and I saw nothing unusual." His hand adjusted his handkerchief, the gold R glinting in the light, and Miss Marple noted the gesture, recalling its similarity to the smudge on the original bottle. Yet his position at the judging table, elevated and distant, made direct tampering unlikely. She thought of a village squire who had once orchestrated a scandal through a proxy. Was Sir Reginald's disdain a motive or merely a distraction? Clara moved next, her hands steady as she rolled out a mock pastry, her eyes fixed on her task. "I was here," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I didn't go near Henry's station. I was too focused on my pie." Her fingers brushed the counter, and Miss Marple saw the same tremor she'd noticed during their tea, a sign of nerves, but not necessarily guilt. Clara's grudge against Henri was potent, but her sincerity suggested innocence, or a well-rehearsed act. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on her, thinking of Mrs. Carter, whose nervous fidgeting had once betrayed a theft, but whose heart had been true. Martin was less composed, his movements jerky as he mimicked adjusting a light near Henri's station. "I was checking the rigs," he said, his voice high with strain. "The glare was off and I had to fix it. I didn't touch his ingredients." His eyes darted to the decoy bottle, and Miss Marple saw a flicker of recognition, quickly masked. His desperation for ratings, his proximity to the bottle, made him a candidate, but his nervous energy suggested panic rather than calculation. She thought of Mr. Hoskins, the grocer, whose staged theft had been impulsive, not planned. Was Martin's role similar or something darker? Beatrice was the last, her movements as precise as ever as she recreated her salmon sphere at her station. She handled a pipette with surgical care, her eyes flicking briefly to the decoy bottle on Henri's counter. "I was here," she said, her voice smooth as cream. "My dish required focus. I had no time to notice anything else." But as she reached for a vial of her own, her hand hesitated near the decoy bottle, her fingers brushing its rim before pulling back. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. The gesture was fleeting, but it was enough. Beatrice's precision, her familiarity with obscure ingredients, made her the perfect candidate to slip aconite into the bitters. The smudge, the monogrammed fibers, pointed to her, but Miss Marple knew that truth, like a delicate soufflé, could collapse if pressed too soon. Craddock, watching closely, stepped forward. "Miss Lyle," he said, his voice sharp, "that bottle, did you recognize it?" Beatrice's composure faltered, her eyes widening for a fraction of a second. "It's just bitters," she said, her voice steady but strained. "I didn't touch it during the competition." But her hand trembled slightly, and Miss Marple saw the crack in her facade, like a village seamstress's dropped needle that had once revealed a thief. She thought of Mrs. Eldridge, whose ruthless pruning had hidden a darker intent. Beatrice's hesitation was a confession in itself. Later, in the morning room, Craddock confronted Beatrice with the evidence: the silk fibers, the monogrammed B, the aconite in the bitters. Under pressure, her cool exterior crumbled. "I couldn't let him win again," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Henri took everything, my sponsors, my reputation. I slipped the aconite into the bitters, knowing he'd use it in his bisque. I wiped the bottle, but I must have missed a spot." Her confession was quiet, but it carried the weight of years of resentment, a rivalry that had curdled into murder. Miss Marple, her knitting resumed, listened as Craddock led Beatrice away, her needles clicking softly. The trap had worked, the smudge and the decoy revealing the hand that stirred the poison. She thought of a village fete where a single misplaced crumb had exposed a saboteur. Here, the smudge had been the key, a careless gesture in a moment of haste. The final course was served, and the truth, bitter but clear, had risen to the surface. Chapter 11. The Aftertaste of Truth. The manor house, its ancient stones now bathed in the soft glow of a St. Mary Mead morning, seemed to exhale as the tension of Henri Dubois's murder began to dissipate. The grand halls, once reverberating with the clatter of culinary ambition and the sharp edge of suspicion, now carried only the quiet tread of constables concluding their duties. The village beyond the manor's windows stirred with its usual rhythm, carts rattling to market, children scampering toward the schoolhouse. But within, the air held a lingering trace of the drama that had unfolded. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the manor's morning room, her knitting bag at her side, sipped a cup of tea, her needles clicking softly as she reflected on the case's resolution. The fire in the grate crackled gently, casting a warm light over the chintz curtains, but her mind was still stirring the final ingredients of the mystery, ensuring no bitter aftertaste remained. Inspector Craddock had taken Beatrice Lyle into custody the previous evening, her confession in the studio, a quiet unraveling of the carefully crafted facade she had maintained. The smudged bitters bottle, the monogrammed silk fibers, and the aconite's deadly precision had pointed to her, but it was Miss Marple's subtle trap, the decoy bottle with its deliberate smudge, that had coaxed the truth from her. Beatrice's rivalry with Henri, a wound festering since their clash in Paris, had driven her to an act as calculated as her molecular gastronomy. Yet Miss Marple, ever cautious, knew that truth, like a delicate dish, required careful handling to avoid spoilage. She had lingered in the morning room, at Craddock's request, to discuss the case's finer points and ensure no loose threads remained in the tapestry of deceit. Craddock entered, his face weary but relieved, his notebook tucked under his arm. "Miss Marple," he said, settling into a chair opposite her. "You've done it, again. That trick with the decoy bottle, it was brilliant. Beatrice's reaction gave her away, and the fibers sealed it. We've got her confession, and the lab confirmed the aconite. Case closed, I'd say." His tone was warm, but Miss Marple's eyes held a flicker of doubt, her needles pausing briefly. "I'm glad to have been of help, Inspector," she said, her voice soft but thoughtful. "But in my village, I've learned that a confession, like a cake, can sometimes hide a bitter core. Are we certain no one else played a part?" Craddock raised an eyebrow, accustomed to her probing nature. "You think there's more?" Beatrice admitted to slipping the aconite into the bitters during the chaos of the second round. The fibers match her monogrammed scarf. She must have wiped the bottle in haste, leaving the smudge. The evidence is airtight. Miss Marple nodded, her needles resuming their rhythm. "It's a tidy recipe, Inspector," she said, "but I've known dishes that looked perfect, yet lacked a certain flavor. Beatrice's motive is clear. Her rivalry with Henri was a fire that burned for years. But what of the others? Motives, like spices, can blend in unexpected ways." She sipped her tea, her mind drifting to the other suspects, each a potent ingredient in the case. Clara Henshaw's grudge, born of Henry's theft of her recipes, had simmered quietly, but her sincerity during their tea suggested innocence, or a masterful performance. Martin Greaves's desperation, his show teetering on cancellation, had given him reason to orchestrate a scandal, but his nervous energy seemed more reactive than calculating. Sir Reginald Hawthorne's pride, wounded by Henry's defiance, had cast him as a bully, but his distance from the station made direct involvement unlikely. Miss Marple thought of a village fete, where a seemingly clear culprit had masked a subtler accomplice. Here she wondered if Beatrice's confession was the whole dish or merely its garnish. "Consider the smudge, Inspector," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "It was deliberate, almost too perfect, as if meant to be found. In my village, I once knew a woman who left a broken vase to point to her rival, only to be caught by her own carelessness. Could someone have planted the fibers, knowing Beatrice's scarf was distinctive?" Craddock frowned, his fingers tapping his notebook. "You think someone framed her? But who? Clara was too focused, Martin too frantic, and Sir Reginald was at the judging table. None had the means to plant evidence so precisely." Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile. "Means perhaps not," she said, "but opportunity is a subtle thing. The studio was a whirlwind, cameras, crew, contestants all moving. A clever hand could slip a fiber into place, just as they slipped the aconite." Craddock leaned back, his expression a mix of skepticism and curiosity. "You're suggesting a conspiracy? That's a stretch, even for you, Miss Marple." She shook her head, her needles clicking steadily. "Not a conspiracy, Inspector, but a nudge. In my village, a man once staged a theft to draw attention from his own misdeeds. Martin, for instance. His show's survival depended on scandal. Could he have seen an opportunity in Beatrice's rivalry, using her scarf to point the finger?" Craddock's eyes narrowed, and he jotted a note. "It's possible," he admitted. "But Beatrice's confession was detailed. She knew the aconite's properties, how it would blend with the bitters. That's not something you fake." Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning to the studio's chaos, where a single moment could hide a multitude of sins. She recalled Martin's fleeting pause near Henri's station, his claim of adjusting a light. Had he seen Beatrice's scarf, perhaps dropped in haste, and used it to his advantage? Or was Clara's trembling hand, so steady in her baking, capable of a subtler act? Sir Reginald's handkerchief, with its monogram, had briefly seemed a clue, but his distance from the station made it unlikely. She thought of a village seamstress who had once planted a rival's needle to deflect blame. Here, the fibers felt too convenient, a garnish too perfectly placed. She rose, her knitting tucked into her bag, and made her way to the studio's edge, where a constable stood guard. "Just a moment, if you please," she said, her voice soft but firm. The young man stepped aside, allowing her to survey Henri's station one last time. The chalk outline of the bitters bottle was gone, but the counter held a faint trace of saffron, its golden threads scattered like clues. Her eyes fell on a nearby tray, where a small cloth, overlooked in the initial sweep, lay folded. She leaned closer, her handkerchief shielding her hand, and noted a faint stain. Not saffron, but something darker, like ink or oil. Had it been used to wipe the bottle, or was it another misdirection? She thought of Mrs. Eldridge, whose pristine roses had hidden a ruthless streak. Here, the cloth was a thread worth pulling. Returning to the morning room, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her needles clicking as she turned the thought over in her mind. Beatrice's confession was the main course, but the aftertaste lingered. A hint of something more, a spice not yet identified. She spoke with Craddock again, suggesting a closer look at Martin's movements, particularly his access to the studio's props. A discreet search, conducted that afternoon, revealed a vial of ink in Martin's office, its cap loose, its contents matching the stain on the cloth. Confronted, Martin's nervous energy crumbled. "I didn't kill him," he stammered, "but I saw Beatrice near the bottle. I smeared it with her scarf, just to make sure she'd be caught. The ratings were everything. I couldn't let the show fail." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed, her needles still. Martin's act was not murder, but manipulation, a desperate bid to amplify the scandal. Beatrice's guilt was real, but Martin's nudge had ensured its discovery, a garnish that had nearly spoiled the truth. Craddock, shaking his head, arranged for Martin's questioning on charges of tampering with evidence. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind at ease. The case was closed, the recipe complete, but the aftertaste of truth, bitter and complex, lingered in the quiet of the Manor's morning room. Chapter 12. The Recipe Revealed. The manor house, its weathered stones catching the golden hues of a St. Mary mead afternoon, seemed to settle into a quiet resolution as the investigation into Henri Dubois's murder reached its close. The grand halls, once alive with the frenetic energy of the great culinary clash, now carried only the soft murmur of departing constables and the rustle of leaves from the gardens beyond. The village, stirring with its usual rhythm of market carts and gossip at the Green Dragon, had begun to weave the tale of Henri's death into its tapestry of stories. But within the manor's walls, the air held a final note of clarity, like a dish perfectly seasoned at last. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the manor's library, her knitting bag at her side, sipped a cup of chamomile tea, her needles clicking softly as she reflected on the case's conclusion. The fire in the grate cast a warm glow over the leather-bound books, but her mind was still tasting the final flavors of the mystery, ensuring no bitter trace remained. Inspector Craddock had joined her in the library, his face a mix of exhaustion and satisfaction as he closed his notebook with a decisive snap. The arrest of Beatrice Lyle, coupled with Martin Greaves's confession to tampering with evidence, had brought the case to a tidy end. Yet Miss Marple's presence was a reminder that even the most straightforward recipes could hide subtle complexities. "Miss Marple," Craddock said, settling into a chair opposite her. "Your instincts were spot on, as always. Beatrice's confession, the fibers, the aconite, it all lined up. And catching Martin's little stunt with the scarf was the icing on the cake. I'd say we've served justice." His tone was warm, but Miss Marple's eyes held a flicker of her characteristic caution, her needles pausing briefly as she considered his words. "Justice, Inspector, is a delicate dish," she said, her voice soft but thoughtful. "In my village, I once knew a baker who thought her pie was perfect, only to find a pinch too much salt had spoiled it. Beatrice's guilt is clear, but I wonder if we've tasted the full recipe." Craddock's brow furrowed, his hand resting on his notebook. "You think there's more?" Beatrice admitted to slipping the aconite into the bitters bottle, and Martin confessed to smearing it with her scarf to ensure she'd be caught. The lab confirmed the poison, and the fibers matched her monogram. "What's left to question?" Miss Marple smiled faintly, her needles resuming their rhythm. "Only the smallest details, Inspector. Like a garnish overlooked, they can change the flavor of the whole." She sipped her tea, her mind drifting to the studio's chaos, where a single moment had held the key to Henri's death. Beatrice's confession had been detailed, her motive rooted in a rivalry that had simmered for years. The smudged bitters bottle, with its monogrammed fibers, pointed to her hand, and her hesitation near the decoy bottle had sealed her guilt. Yet Miss Marple, ever wary of too perfect clues, thought of Martin's role. Not a murderer, but a manipulator, his desperation for ratings driving him to amplify the scandal. The stained cloth she'd noticed with its trace of ink matching Martin's vial had confirmed his interference, but it also raised a question. Had his actions obscured another's involvement, or was he merely a garnish on Beatrice's crime? Her thoughts turned to the other suspects, each a spice in the broth of this mystery. Clara Henshaw's grudge, born of Henri's theft of her recipes, had been potent, but her sincerity during their tea suggested a heart too honest for murder. Sir Reginald Hawthorne's pride, wounded by Henri's defiance, had cast him as a bully, but his distance from the station made direct action unlikely. Miss Marple recalled a village incident where a too obvious clue, a broken vase, had masked a subtler truth. Here the monogrammed fibers felt almost too convenient, as if arranged to ensure Beatrice's downfall. Had Martin, in his haste to point the finger, overlooked another hand in the mix? Or was Beatrice's confession the full dish, with Martin's tampering merely a flourish? She leaned forward slightly, her voice gentle but probing. "Inspector, tell me, when you searched Martin's office, did you find anything else? A note, perhaps, or a tool that might suggest more than tampering?" Craddock frowned, flipping open his notebook. "Nothing significant," he said. "The vial of ink, some production notes, a few scripts. Why do you ask?" Miss Marple's eyes gleamed, her needles clicking steadily. "In my village, I once found a letter tucked in a book, overlooked by all but revealing a hidden motive. Martin's desperation was clear, but he's a man who plans. Lights, cameras, angles. Could he have known more about the aconite than he let on?" Craddock shook his head, but his expression was thoughtful. He swore he only smeared the bottle after seeing Beatrice near it. His focus was the show, not murder. Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning to the studio's layout, where every station had been a stage for ambition and deceit. She recalled the scattered fennel seeds near Henri's station, undisturbed yet close to the smudged bottle. Had they been brushed aside in haste or left deliberately to distract? She thought of a village baker who had once scattered crumbs to mislead a rival. Here, the seeds felt like a clue, small but telling. "Inspector," she said, "might we look at the studio one last time? There's a detail, a tray of fennel seeds, that troubles me. It's a small thing, but in my experience, small things are the grains that tip the scale." Craddock, accustomed to her instincts, agreed, and they made their way to the studio, where a lone constable stood guard. The space was quiet now, its gleaming counters cleared of all but the ghosts of the competition. Miss Marple stood by Henri's station, her eyes tracing the spot where the bitters bottle had stood, its chalk outline a faint memory. The tray of fennel seeds, still scattered, caught her attention, and she leaned closer, her handkerchief shielding her hand. Among the seeds was a single strand of silk, not monogrammed but dyed a vivid scarlet, the color of Beatrice's jacket, not her scarf. Miss Marple's lips pursed. The strand was too fine to be accidental, too deliberate to be overlooked. "Inspector," she said, her voice soft but firm. "This strand, it's from Beatrice's jacket, not her scarf. Martin's tampering pointed to her, but this suggests she was at the station, handling the seeds, perhaps to distract from her act." Craddock's eyes widened, and he called for a forensic officer to bag the strand. "You're right," he said, his voice tinged with admiration. Beatrice's confession mentioned the bitters, but not the seeds. She must have scattered them to cover her tracks, not expecting Martin to add his own flourish. Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking in her mind's rhythm. The strand, like a village seamstress's dropped thread, confirmed Beatrice's guilt, while Martin's interference had nearly muddied the dish. Returning to the library, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her mind at ease. The recipe was complete. Beatrice's rivalry had driven her to poison the bitters, her precision ensuring the aconite's deadly blend. Martin's tampering, a desperate bid for ratings, had amplified her guilt, but the fennel seeds and the scarlet strand had revealed her hand. Clara's grudge and Sir Reginald's pride, though potent, were mere spices in the broth, not the poison itself. Miss Marple thought of a village fete, where a single misplaced crumb had exposed a saboteur. Here, the strand had been the final garnish, completing the dish of truth. As Craddock prepared to leave, his notebook tucked away, he paused at the door. "Miss Marple," he said, a smile breaking through his fatigue. "You've a knack for finding the smallest grains of truth. St. Mary Mead's lucky to have you." She smiled faintly, her needles clicking softly. "It's only a matter of watching, Inspector," she said. "People, like recipes, reveal themselves in time." The manor house, its secrets laid bare, settled into the quiet of a case resolved, and Miss Marple sipped her tea, the aftertaste of truth as satisfying as a perfectly baked loaf.